It's a nice day to be outside, but it's also a nice day to review a book. And you know what? 2021 whoa, the future. 2021 isn't all that bad. And you know why? It's because we have a new Tolkien book to enjoy. Unlike the last Tolkien release, A Fall of Gondolin, which was of course connected to the Silmarillion, this is not a novel or a work of fiction per se. It's more of an encyclopedia of his legendarium. So before reading this and reviewing this, my extent of deeper Silmarillion cuts was the funny tidbit about Celeborn and his Sindarin name being Teleporno, with an umlaut, of course. So that immature joke out of the way, today I will be talking about the nature of Middle-earth, with a subtitle Late Writings on the Lands, Inhabitants and Metaphysics of Middle-earth. It was collected from Tolkien's final writings and notes that he wrote before he passed away, and this time it was edited by Carl F. Hostetter. Apologies if I mispronounced his last name. So he is the current head of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship, which is itself a part of a larger whole, and the larger whole being the Mythiopoetic Society, which is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1967, and the sort of goal of this organization was to study the collective works of Inklings. Inklings being the famously informal writing literature writing group of course Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams, while they were all at Oxford. And this is also of course the first published work after the passing of Christopher Tolkien, who left us sadly last year. So allow me to dedicate this video to him, because without his lifelong work and efforts, we would not have the treasure trove of stories we have today. I just wanted to add that I do not share the cynicism about posthumously published works of Tolkien specifically, because they were all impeccable in my opinion. And let's delve into the book itself. So, since this is not a novel or a poem, there are no characters or plot or even prose to criticize. I will pick a few of my favorite entries in the book and to see if it strikes your fancy as much as it did mine. Sort of first thing that I wanted to point out is the epigraphs in the book. It's one of the coolest things, in my opinion, in this book, if they can be called that. So every book is split into parts, and parts have individual chapters, and every part at the beginning, or even a chapter, has a small epigraph which contains commentaries on actual source notes and the state that they were found in. So for example, there is an entry: this text is found among the last writings that Christopher Tolkien dated to the last year of his father's life. It occupies 2.5 pages and is written in a slightly hasty hand in black nib pen, and so on and so forth. And the whole book is chock full of these little notes containing commentaries about that. So I mentioned that the book is divided into parts. Part 1 is mostly about time measurements and aging, and it starts with a more serious entry. So, according to Tolkien, these are the differences in elf to human aging and maturing. So, for example, we can see here that in elf years, an elf child conceived was born 9 years of mortal time. And the sort of relation between the conversion is 12 to 1 in comparison to mortal years. So a 24-year-old man would be actually 288 years old, which would be the Elven 24-year-old in a roundabout way. Yeah. And the second part, for example, which is called Body, Mind and Spirit, deals with things like pronouns. So, for example, there is this tidbit. The Elvish languages did not distinguish grammatically between male or masculine and female feminine. Thus, se meant he or she, but there was a distinction made between animate and inanimate. Animates included not only rational creatures, such as speaking people, but all things living and reproducing their kind. To these were applied the pronouns such as he, she. Inanimates included not only all physical objects recognized or thought of as distinct things, such as river, mountain, and so on. So we can see the relationship here between the quote-unquote practical distinction of pronouns in day-to-day life of elves and their various languages. The same part has a chapter that describes character traits and visuals of certain characters, and this is one of my favorite parts in the book, where Tolkien is very clearly throwing shade at Radagast, the wizard. So I quote, "Radagast was fond of beasts and birds and found them easier to deal with. He did not become proud and domineering, but neglectful and easygoing, and he had very little to do with elves or men, although obviously resistance to Sauron had to be sought chiefly in their cooperation. But since he remained of good will, though he had not much courage, his work in fact helped Gandalf at crucial moments. Though it is clear that Gandalf, with greater insight and compassion, had in fact more knowledge of birds and beasts than Radagast, and was regarded by them with more respect and affection. This contrast is already to be seen in The Hobbit, where Bjorn, a lover of animals but also of gardens and flowers, thought Radagast a good enough fellow but evidently not very effective." So yeah, we can see that Radagast was too much of a, I don't know what would be the modern day equivalent. I don't want to say stoner, but someone who does not want to take initiative and just want to get by. But he was good at heart. On to the next part of the book, called The World, Its Lands and Its Inhabitants, which I think is one of the most interesting ones. So one of the interesting parts is the recipe, sort of, or the background of lembas bread. So it is said here that the origin of lembas bread was taught to them by Orome, and it was made from the seed of wheat, and was instructed to Quendi to how to grow it, harvest it, store it, grind it, knead it, bread it into unleavened bread, which was made by bread women. And here we see sort of a background of the art of making it. And Arwen is also mentioned, and wife of Elrond, which is an interesting detail, Celebrian. She's not that often mentioned, I don't think so, from memory in the Silmarillion, for example. And sadly, with Galadriel's departure and the death of Arwen, the Western corn and whey bread were lost forever in Middle-earth, which is tragic, but I think that hobbits still have some tasty, tasty bread. And I'm sure they would share the recipe of it with other races if they ask nicely. Yeah, and the last thing that I wanted to include is not an encyclopedic entry, but more of a deleted scene from Lord of the Rings. And after I retell it, there is actually a background to why it was cut. And it was pretty charming, but let us hear it. So, this text was actually written on a torn half sheet, according to the book, and was originally intended as an insertion in the drafting to the chapter The White Rider, which is the chapter 5 of book 3, or Return of the King. "What of our horses?" said Legolas. "I was forgetting them," said Aragorn. "We cannot lead them into the forest. There will be no food for them in there. They must be set free so that they can return as they will to their own master. We do not know how long our search will take or whither it will lead us." "But we do not know yet that it will take us into the forest," said Gimli. "At least let us take the horses to the edge of the wood. It is a long walk from here to Theoden's halls, and you promised to ride back there with our borrowed mounts." "When our quest was over or proved vain," said Aragorn. "Let the horses judge," said Legolas. "I will speak to them." Running lightly over the grass, he returned to the tree under which they had camped, and going to the horses, he untethered them, fondling their heads and whispering in their ears. "Go free now, Hasophel and Arad," he said aloud. "Wait for us a while, but no longer that seems good to you." The horses looked solemnly at him for a moment, and then walked together behind the elf towards the riverbank. There they stood quietly, like folk on a doorstep when friends are taking their leave. As the companions went away up the slope, they lifted their heads and whinnied, and then, bending to the grass afar, they strayed together, browsing peacefully as they were in their home pasture. So this is a scene where Legolas is quite literally talking to horses. And it's kind of touching, really. Very gentle, very Tolkien. And I think the scene itself works, but the reason it was cut is because it's actually made redundant, or rather it does not fit into the next chapter. So the text here describes Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas on the morning after their encounter with the old man by the campfire, which was on the verge of Fangorn Forest when they were entering it. So in the published Lord of the Rings edition, this happens in the chapter White Rider and not the chapter Riders of Rohan, and the latter chapter ends on the previous night with the three companions still camping at the entry to the forest. So it kind of became redundant. So also in the published chapter, the horses run away. So the horses, to quote, "the horses were gone, they had dragged their pickets and disappeared." So yeah, that's the reason for not including this. And I could go on and on and on about the interesting entries and these are well, just personally that caught my eye. So the way I would recommend this book is not to be a weirdo like me, who used to read encyclopedias like books when he was a small child. And this is not bragging, this was just, oh, I ran out of the books to read. I had a friend who had a bunch of encyclopedias and I would borrow those encyclopedias so I could read them. Instead, treat it as encyclopedia. If you get this book, go through the list of contents and open a chapter that contains something that draws your eye, and hopefully get as much satisfaction as I did from this. So this would be all from me for now. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you as always to my faithful patrons on Patreon. If you want to support me on Patreon, the link is in description, and if not, that's also okay. Please do subscribe and like, and see you next time. I have a lot of content prepared. Some of it all is gonna be here very soon. Bye bye.